The quarterly review had been running nearly an hour behind schedule when Brennan Hollis stood up from the head of the long mahogany table, adjusted his cufflinks without looking down, and announced to the room that NorthBridge Analytics was moving into a new chapter, one that required, in his words, a different caliber of strategic guidance. Then he looked directly at Adwoa Quartey, who had been sitting quietly at the far end of the table with her notepad open and her pen resting across her knuckles, and told her that her position on the advisory board would be restructured, effective the following month. The room went absolutely still. 7 of the 9 people present had been in that boardroom long enough to know what restructured meant when Brennan Hollis said it with that particular tilt of his chin. 2 of them, the youngest analysts, simply stared at the tabletop. The chief operating officer, a careful man named Roger, who had learned early in his career never to show too much on his face, kept his eyes fixed on a point somewhere just above Adwoa's shoulder. Nobody said a word. Nobody moved. Adwoa set her pen down on the notepad. She closed it without a sound. She had been the one who first explained to NorthBridge's original 3 founders why their early risk modeling approach would eventually collapse under real-world data conditions. And she had spent 11 months of her own time she could have spent on a dozen more profitable things, helping them rebuild it from the foundation up. She had done all of this without a salary, without equity, without a line of credit attached to her name in any official NorthBridge document, because she believed the platform could change how credit unions across the country assessed risk for people who had always been told no, people like the ones she had grown up beside in Scarborough. She picked up her pen, slid it into her jacket pocket, and stood. She did not look at Brennan. She looked once around the table, meeting the eyes of the 2 analysts who were still staring downward, as if she wanted them to know she saw them. And then she thanked the room for 11 productive months, pushed her chair in neatly, and walked out of the 43rd floor boardroom of the Bay Street Tower without a backward glance. Her footsteps were quiet and even on the polished floor, and the soft sound of the conference room door closing behind her felt to everyone remaining in that room louder than it had any right to be. Brennan Hollis was 32 years old and had been installed as chief executive by the venture capital group that had bought controlling interest in NorthBridge 8 months earlier. He held an MBA from a school whose name he managed to work into most conversations, and he had a particular way of leaning forward at the start of meetings that was meant to convey urgency but had begun to read, to those who had watched him long enough, as something closer to performance. He spoke often and confidently about disruption, about the coming obsolescence of intuition in data-driven environments, and about the need to replace what he called founder-era instinct with what he called scalable, verifiable process. He had never built anything himself, but he had a comprehensive theory about building things, and he treated that theory with the same reverence that another man might have reserved for genuine experience. He genuinely believed he was doing the right thing. That was, perhaps, the most important thing to understand about Brennan Hollis. Adwoa Quartey had grown up in a 2-bedroom apartment on the 14th floor of a subsidized housing complex in Scarborough, the daughter of parents who had come from Ghana with nursing credentials that Ontario refused to recognize. Her mother had spent 9 years requalifying while cleaning hospital rooms on the night shift. Her father had driven a taxi 6 evenings a week and taught himself bookkeeping on the side, sitting at the kitchen table with a textbook propped open against a mug because there was nowhere else to put it. Adwoa had taught herself to write code in the Scarborough Civic Center library on Saturday afternoons using programming textbooks that were always slightly out of date, and an internet connection that timed out every 20 minutes if you did not keep clicking something. She had built her first data platform, a tool for aggregating community health records in underserved neighborhoods, in the 2nd bedroom of a rented townhouse in Brampton when she was 27, working nights after her day job at a downtown accounting firm. By the time she was 35, she had sold Cascadia Systems the infrastructure company she had built from that townhouse bedroom, for $340 million to an American technology conglomerate that had tried to acquire her twice before she agreed. She had given a meaningful portion of that money to the neighborhood where she had grown up, and she had invested the rest with the same careful, patient attention she had always given to systems that required time to be understood properly. She had come to NorthBridge not for money and not for prestige, but because she recognized something in their early architecture that reminded her of the problem she had spent her own 20s trying to solve. How to make risk visible for people a spreadsheet had already written off. Now she was gone, and Brennan Hollis had replaced her with 7 senior data scientists recruited from graduate programs at Waterloo, McGill, and the University of British Columbia, each of them arriving with publication records and research portfolios, and the confident air of people who had never yet encountered a problem that resisted their methods for long. They were brilliant. There was no question about that. Their understanding of machine learning architecture was sophisticated. Their command of statistical modeling was thorough, and the pace at which they could process and interpret data was genuinely impressive. Brennan had them set up in the new open-plan innovation space on the 42nd floor, all standing desks and exposed concrete, and he had come down personally on their first morning to welcome them with a catered breakfast and a speech about the future of Canadian fintech. Their first assignment was straightforward on paper. Validate and stabilize the NorthBridge risk assessment engine ahead of a live regulatory demonstration scheduled for 6 weeks out. The demonstration was the culmination of 2 years of work, a contract with the Ontario Credit Union Association that, if successful, would expand into a national rollout worth close to $200 million over 5 years. Representatives from the Office of the Superintendent of Financial Institutions were expected to attend. So were executives from 4 of Canada's largest credit unions and several members of a federal advisory panel on financial inclusion. The engine needed to run cleanly. It needed to produce consistent, verifiable outputs in real time, under live data conditions, in front of people whose job it was to find exactly the kind of anomalies that would sink a contract before the ink dried. The 7 data scientists ran every diagnostic available to them. They tested input pipelines, reviewed model weights, stress-tested the validation layers against 3 separate benchmark datasets, and fed the system simulated credit profiles drawn from American fintech standards, which were the most widely cited in the academic literature they had trained on. Every technical readout came back within normal parameters. The system looked fine on paper. But when they ran it against live Canadian credit union data, actual applications, actual borrower profiles, the kind of files the system would face during the demonstration, the outputs were wrong. Not catastrophically wrong, subtly wrong. The kind of wrong that a regulator with experience would recognize immediately. Risk scores that drifted slightly but consistently in a direction that made no mathematical sense given the inputs. A pattern of anomaly that appeared reliably in a specific segment of the portfolio, and then vanished when tested in isolation. They spent the first week convinced it was a data pipeline issue. They rebuilt the pipeline from scratch. The anomaly persisted. They spent the second week certain it was a model calibration problem. They recalibrated every weight in the system, using the most current academic benchmarks available. The anomaly persisted. By the third week, 2 of the 7 were no longer sleeping a full night, and the other 5 had stopped eating lunch away from their desks. The standing desks had been pushed together into one large working cluster, and the catered breakfasts had long since been replaced by takeout containers that sat, forgotten, on windowsills. The mood in the innovation space had shifted from confident to quiet, and then from quiet to something that was not quite fear, but was close enough to it that nobody wanted to name it aloud. Brennan received the status updates through his assistant, and responded with messages that grew shorter and less patient with each passing day. The demonstration was now 3 weeks out. The OAQA had already begun circulating materials to the attending regulators. Two of the credit union executives had scheduled internal briefings with their own boards to present the expected results. There was no graceful way to postpone, and Brennan knew it, and knowing it made him still in a way that people who worked around him had learned to treat as a warning sign. He had not told anyone that he was beginning to understand the size of his mistake. He was not sure yet that he was ready to say the words, even to himself. It was Wendell Marsh who finally turned the problem around, not by solving it, but by understanding it differently. Wendell was 58 years old and had spent most of his career in systems architecture at a sequence of firms that had either been acquired or quietly dissolved, which was the fate of many firms in his field. He had come to NorthBridge 2 years earlier as a senior consultant, and had stayed because the work interested him in a way that most work had stopped doing a long time ago. He was not one of the 7 new scientists, and he had not been invited to the Innovation Space Cluster. He worked out of a smaller room on the same floor with 2 monitors and a whiteboard that was always covered in notation, and he had watched the 7 new arrivals with the quiet patience of a man who had seen many confident teams reach the same wall. He began, on a Tuesday evening after most of the floor had gone dark, by pulling the version history of the codebase. Every commit, every branch, every documentation note stretching back to the earliest prototype. He was not looking for anything specific. He was looking in the way that people look when they have run out of specific ideas and need the problem to show them what they have missed. What he found stopped him partway through his coffee. Across the entire development history of the NorthBridge risk engine, every major version, every significant improvement, every structural revision that had moved the system from promising prototype to something that actually worked under real conditions, a single name appeared consistently in the commit annotations, not as the lead architect, not as the project owner, in the notes, in the margin comments, in the documentation that explained why certain decisions had been made in ways that contradicted standard practice. A name that appeared at the bottom of explanatory notes, the way a translator's name sometimes appears at the bottom of a text. Essential, obvious once you saw it, invisible until you thought to look. The name was Adwoa Quartey. Wendell sat with that for a long moment. Then he began reading the notes themselves. The specific anomaly that had defeated 7 brilliant data scientists for 3 weeks was not, as they had assumed, a calibration error or a pipeline fault. It was a feature. It was a deliberate, carefully documented decision that Adwoa had made and annotated with a clarity that would have been immediately apparent to anyone who had read the documentation before touching the system. The NorthBridge risk engine had been built to assess Canadian credit risk, and Canadian credit risk had a specific seasonal pattern tied directly to the federal mortgage stress test guidelines introduced under OSFI's B20 regulations, a uniquely Canadian variable that had no equivalent in American academic benchmarks because it described a regulatory condition that existed only in Canada. Adwoa had built a seasonal adjustment module into the engine's core weighting system that compensated for this pattern. She had documented it in 11 separate notes spread across 4 versions of the codebase. The 7 data scientists, working from American fintech standards and international academic benchmarks, had encountered the module in their early calibration work, identified it as an anomalous parameter that conflicted with their models, and quietly disabled it on the 4th day of testing. They had done exactly what their training had taught them to do when a system parameter produced outputs that conflicted with established models. They had removed the only thing that made the system work. Wendell read through the documentation twice, then printed it, stacked the pages, and carried them upstairs to Brennan's office at 7:30 in the morning. He set them on the desk without preamble and waited while Brennan read. It did not take long. Brennan asked very quietly where Adwoa Quartey was now. Nobody in the company had a current contact for her. Her departure had been processed efficiently and impersonally, as efficient and impersonal departures tend to be, and no one in leadership had maintained any relationship after she left. The HR team spent the better part of a day making phone calls before a lead came through. Not from any official record, but from one of the junior analysts, a young woman who mentioned almost in passing that she had seen a social media post the previous week about a free coding workshop for high school students at a community center in Scarborough, and that the instructor listed was a woman named Adwoa Quartey. Brennan drove there himself. He went alone, without his briefing notes or his assistant, and he parked his car on a side street beside a community center whose sign was slightly weathered at one corner. Through the glass door, he could see a room full of teenagers at mismatched workstations, each of them bent over a keyboard with varying degrees of concentration. At the front of the room, writing on a whiteboard in blue marker, was a woman in a gray hoodie and dark jeans who had once sold a company for $340 million and was now teaching 15-year-olds in Scarborough how to build their first data query. She heard the door open and turned around. She did not look surprised to see him. She did not look pleased, exactly, but she did not look angry either, and somehow that was worse. The complete absence of anger where anger would have been entirely justified. She excused herself from the class with the easy patience of someone who had learned to take interruptions in stride, and she met him in the hallway with her arms loose at her sides and her expression giving away nothing except attention. He told her what had happened. He told her about the engine and the 7 scientists and the demonstration and the 3 weeks of failure and what Wendell had found in the codebase. He told her clearly, and without softening any of it, because some part of him understood that she would find softening more insulting than the truth. When he finished, she shook her head. No. He had expected negotiation. He had prepared for it. He had figures ready, a revised advisory agreement, a substantial increase over her previous arrangement, an enhanced title with board-level standing. She shook her head at all of it with the same quiet firmness. And when he asked her why, she leaned against the wall of the hallway and told him something that was not in any official NorthBridge record. 12 years earlier, when she was still in her late 20s and her first real data platform was beginning to show what it could do, she had developed the seasonal adjustment methodology that would eventually become the foundation of the NorthBridge engine. She had developed it alone, on her own time, over 14 months of evenings and weekends, driven by the same stubborn conviction that had driven most of the work in her life. The belief that a problem was solvable if you were patient enough to stay with it. When the methodology was ready, she had brought it to the technical director at the company where she was then employed. She had explained it carefully. She had shown him the data. He had presented it at a board meeting as his own research the following month. He had received a performance bonus and a directorial promotion. Adwoa had received a card from his assistant, thanking her for her contribution to the team. She had not filed a complaint. She had not made a scene. She had taken the weekend to feel the full weight of what had happened, and then on Monday morning she had gone back to her desk and kept working. Not because the injustice had not hurt, but because the work itself had never been about credit. The work had always been about the problem, and the problem did not care who got the recognition. Brennan stood in the hallway of a Scarborough community center and said nothing for a moment. The sound of keyboards clicking came faintly from the room behind her, and somewhere outside a bus pulled away from a stop. He asked her whether she had ever regretted staying silent. She told him that she had thought about it, and that what she had concluded was that staying silent had been a choice, and that the choice had cost her something real, and that she had made it anyway because she knew her own reasons, and she could live with them. She said it without defensiveness, in the way that someone speaks when they have made peace with a complicated truth. Then she told him her condition. She did not want the advisory contract reinstated. She did not want a title. She wanted NorthBridge to establish a funded, ongoing mentorship program for students from underrepresented communities who were interested in data science and financial technology, staffed by company engineers, paid for by the company, accountable to a community advisory committee that she would help select. Not a marketing initiative, not a press release, a real program with real students and real resources, the kind that did not disappear after the first good quarter. Brennan agreed before she had finished the sentence. He understood, standing there, that this was not a negotiation and never had been. It was simply a statement of what mattered to her, and what did and did not earn her time. She came back on a Thursday morning. Word had moved through the building in the way that important news always moves, quietly and completely, before anyone official has said anything. The 7 data scientists were at their cluster of desks when she walked through the door of the innovation space. They looked up. A few of them had spent the previous evening reading the documentation Wendell had printed, and at least 2 had come to understand, in the small hours of the night, what they had disabled and why. She walked to the main terminal without stopping to speak to anyone, and she read through the system logs for several minutes in complete silence. She was not performing patience. She was genuinely reading, her eyes moving through screens of output data with the steady attention of someone who had designed the system and knew exactly what she was looking for. She found it in under 4 minutes. She typed a single command, 12 characters. She re-enabled the seasonal adjustment module, the parameter that had been turned off on the 4th day by people who had not read the 11 explanatory notes, and she set the weighting back to the value she had calibrated it to, which corresponded to a specific coefficient she had derived from 14 months of observing how Canadian credit union data behaved under OSFI's B20 stress test conditions. It was not a correction that existed in any textbook. It was a correction that existed in her, in the particular way that knowledge lives in a person who has spent years paying attention to one specific thing. She stepped back from the terminal. "Run it," she said. The system produced clean, consistent, accurate outputs in 4.3 seconds. The anomaly was gone. The risk scores were exactly where they should have been. The 7 data scientists stood around the cluster of monitors and watched the results populate the dashboard in real time, and no one spoke for a long moment. One of them, the youngest, a recent Waterloo graduate, who had arrived 6 weeks earlier, with complete confidence in her own methods, let out a slow breath that was not quite a sound. Another simply sat down in his chair, as though something had gone out of his legs. Wendell, standing near the door, watched Adwoa step back from the terminal and fold her arms, and he understood then what it looked like when someone truly knew a system. Not the flash of rescue, but the plainness of it. The quiet efficiency of a person who had never stopped understanding what everyone else had forgotten to read. Brennan called an all-staff meeting the following morning. He stood at the front of the main floor without notes, which was not something he was known for, and without the particular posture of confidence he usually carried into rooms where he was the person with the most authority. He told the company plainly that he had dismissed a member of their advisory team, based on a narrow and insufficient understanding of what that person contributed. He told them that he had replaced irreplaceable knowledge with credentials that were excellent but incomplete, and that the difference had nearly cost NorthBridge everything it had spent 2 years building. He did not offer context or qualification. He did not pivot quickly toward a forward-looking slide. He stood in it for long enough that the room understood he was not performing accountability. He was attempting, for perhaps the first time in his tenure, to actually demonstrate it. Several long-term employees, people who had been at NorthBridge since before the acquisition, exchanged looks that said many things without saying any of them aloud. The 7 data scientists did not respond to the days that followed with resentment. That was perhaps the most unexpected part of everything. They responded with curiosity. One by one, beginning with Wendell as the first and most direct, they asked Adwoa if she would be willing to explain the seasonal adjustment methodology. Not to fix something, but to understand it properly. She agreed. They began gathering in the smaller room with the two monitors and the whiteboard covered in notation. And what emerged over the following weeks was something that had not existed at NorthBridge before. An actual conversation between engineers who understood the theory and a woman who understood the terrain, each of them finding that the other's knowledge made their own more complete. The mentorship program launched 3 months after the regulatory demonstration, which had gone exactly as it was meant to go. The engine ran cleanly in front of the OSFI representatives and the credit union executives and the Federal Advisory Panel, and the contract was signed within the week. Adwoa was not on the stage for any of it. She was standing near the back of the room, watching the data populate on the main display, and her expression was the expression of someone who had already known how it would end. The program began with 12 students from 3 Scarborough high schools. It was staffed by 6 NorthBridge engineers who had volunteered before the company had even formally announced the initiative. The Community Advisory Committee met for the first time in a conference room that had been repurposed from storage space on the 39th floor. And the first person Adwoa introduced to the group was the junior analyst. The one who had known about the community center, the one who had known where to find her. Because finding the right person, Adwoa told them, had always been its own kind of expertise. Adwoa did not take a formal title at NorthBridge. She came in 2 mornings a week and sat with the engineering team and asked the kinds of questions that kept the system honest, and she took the GO train from Scarborough each time, because she had been taking the GO train most of her adult life and saw no reason to stop. The community center coding class continued on Saturday afternoons. The whiteboard in Wendell's room had 3 new lines of notation that had not been there before. Brennan Hollis became, over the course of the year that followed, a different kind of executive than the one who had stood at that boardroom table and restructured Adwoa Quartey's advisory position with a tilt of his chin. He did not become a different person overnight, and he would be the first to say so if asked. But he began spending time on the floors below his office, and he began asking questions before drawing conclusions. And on the evenings when he stayed late and the building was quiet, he sometimes pulled up the codebase version history and read through Adwoa's documentation notes, the way a person reads something they should have read much earlier, carefully, and with the particular attention of someone who has finally learned the cost of skimming. The risk engine ran cleanly. The credit union contract expanded into 3 additional provinces. 12 students from Scarborough learned to write data queries on Saturday afternoons in a room where the chairs did not all match. And somewhere in that building on Bay Street, in documentation written across 11 notes that most people had walked past without stopping to read, was the beginning of an explanation that a woman had left for anyone patient enough to find it, because she had always understood, from a library in Scarborough to a boardroom she walked out of without looking back, that the work survived long after the conversation about who deserved credit for it had run its course and gone quiet.